So the Chinese work on with the three models at the same time and try to compensate failures of one model with the other. So that's basically the key foundations of the miracle. Then we mentioned that there was a period previous to the financial crisis in which those policies changed. It was a period of investment boom. So they moved from technology and manufacturing to property, industrial assets, and infrastructure. They also have all pegged exchange rates, pegged to the dollar, and that created, that favored financial activities and financial speculation, but also led to a loss of export competitiveness. And they moved from being exporters to being importers. It was cheaper to import. That was also at the same time with deregulated capital markets. So there was free access for foreign capital, and local companies were borrowing heavily from external banks. And that was making them more and more vulnerable to changes in global financial patterns. Much of this lending was very irresponsible. Local banks didn't have proper risk assessment policies, and foreign companies also trust in local banks to make their assessments. So there was a lot of risky and unrealistic investment. So you can see how those countries were becoming more and more in debt in foreign currency. And more of the debt was based in dollars. So it was a total change of a model, from a model focused on manufacturing and import to a model focused on financial speculation, borrowing, and trading through the financial markets. So with open capital markets and high levels of debt in foreign currency, firms were extremely vulnerable to speculative moves or sudden stop of funds coming from abroad. So basically the model was depending in having an increased inflow of foreign funds. When that stopped, because the financial market started to become suspicious about the conditions of Asian economies, that triggered the crisis. So the crisis started in Thailand. You have already seen the crisis, I believe, in Asia Pacific. So you basically know that it started in Thailand with the Thai baht had a speculative attack, and it fell from an exchange rate to floating, and it was devaluated by 55%. You can see how the currency was decreasing, was failing with respect to the dollar. That was followed. At the same time, there was also a decrease in real house price index. So there was not only the valuation of the currency, also all the property boom was deflated. The bubble exploded, and there was a fall in the price of property. So after Thailand, Malaysia followed the same pattern. Sharp devaluation and sharp decrease in the price of properties. Then it was followed by Korea, Philippines, and Indonesia, which had the worst situation. With a constant decrease in the value of the currency and the value of property. At the same time, there was a flow and outflow of capitals. All the capital flows that were getting into the country started to go out of the country very quickly. And you can see that in some cases there was just a decrease in foreign investment, but in the case of Indonesia, for instance, there was not only decrease, that capital and investment flew out of the country as fast as they could. And obviously that weakened the whole economy. So that was a phenomenon of contagion in the area. We'll see that more in detail in the next lecture about financial crisis. So why this happened? Again, we had two views. Some of them, all the people that was skeptical about the miracle, say that state interventionism has finally taken its toll. So it took long, but finally all the problems of state intervention were clear. Institutions were corrupted, government as well, and there was more need for reform and less government intervention. So there was this idea that things such as lifetime employment were no longer sustainable, and government shouldn't be expending to create and promote that kind of culture. Too much intervention of state distorted the functioning of market and created inefficient economies. And there was an issue of corporate governance. Most companies were family-owned, or they were closely related with officials from the government. So there was no independence from the government and the companies, or there was no enough control from the market. That was labeled cronyism. And it was one of the reasons that allowed companies to ignore pressures for competitiveness. However, Stiglitz has the opposite view. And they say that the problems of Asian economies started when they were forced to open their capital markets and allow the entrance of foreign funds without developing adequate regulatory structures. The view of Stiglitz adds, those countries were forced by the IMF and particularly the World Trade Organizations to open their markets to foreign investment during the period of investment boom. And that policies were not adequate. And in particular, the dependence of IMF bailouts that they were given in these countries stimulated moral hazard. Cuts in spending and high interest rates were also recommended by the World Bank, but they were not appropriate for this crisis, because here there was an excess of demand. These policies, high interest rates, they work on this excess of demand. In East Asia, there was lack of demand. So you cannot use the same policies. You need to stimulate growth internally. So Stiglitz identified four main causes. There was no good legal framework to help companies, to help identify companies with problems. There was low productivity, because countries stopped focusing on developing productivity and they focused on developing financial models. And there was the liberalization of capital markets that made the economies become dependent in continuous inflow of foreign capital. So this all created a problem of banking liquidity, availability of money in the financial market, and poor management. So after the crisis, the IMF gave assistance to all the countries, but in exchange for conditionalities, to apply the policies of the Washington Consensus. And that created a situation of negative GDP growth. It created a situation of recession. You can see how that was the moment of the crisis, and that's how all the economies went into recession. But then they started to recover. And we can see that those that recovered first were South Korea. At that point, the economy was at the level before the crisis, and then Malaysia. They were followed much later by Thailand, and Indonesia was the last. Actually, the countries that recovered first were the countries that rejected IMF policies. What Malaysia did, they imposed capital controls. They prevented capital from leaving the country. And they rejected both IMF advice and bailouts. And Korea negotiated the advice and kept the exchange rate low, and also maintained the capacity of the industry. So when there was a new boom of demand, they were prepared to supply the market. On the contrary, Thailand and Indonesia followed IMF prescription almost perfectly, And it took Thailand 4 years to recover from recession and 5 years to Indonesia. So that shows again that the problem was not the policies of the government, but the policies that the IMF was trying to impose on them. And after that, we can see